Doomed to Repeated podcast, number 003, Aces in Command. I'm your host, Chuck Bagnato. Olds was disconcerted when he arrived over Fuck-Yen at 1400 Zulu, exactly on schedule, only to find that the MiGs were not airborne. There was a complete undercast with the tops about 7,000 feet, and the communist ground controllers had delayed the MiG takeoffs by about 15 minutes. Olds had no way to know this and had to contemplate calling the mission off for the inbound flights. He passed over Fuck-Yen airfield to the southeast and then made a 180-degree turn to the northwest. The first sign of enemy activity proved sterile when Olds 3 picked up, then lost a bogey moving swiftly in the opposite direction. Seconds later, forward flight, led by his longtime friend, Colonel Daniel Chappie James, burst into the battle area exactly on time. Just as the MiG-21s began popping up out of the undercast, Forward 3 called out to a MiG-21 closing in on Olds' flight. Colonel Olds turned to throw the MiG's aim and attacked another MiG that appeared in his 11 o'clock position, low and a little over a mile away. It was Olds' first engagement with the MiG. With his backseater, Lieutenant Charles Clifton, he set up for an AIM-7 Sparrow attack. The Sparrow was a radar-guided missile intended for use against bomber formations originally. He fired 2 Sparrows and a Sidewinder, but none of them guided. Olds sighted another MiG. They were appearing everywhere now, and used the Phantom's power and energy to vector roll behind it. This time, he fired 2 Sidewinders. The first one blew the MiG-21's wing off to score one of the first kills of the mission. The pilot did not eject. Ralph Wetterman, one of the key planners, had been disappointed to be delegated to flying on Olds as his Dash 2. But in the course of Olds' attack, he slid behind a MiG-21, working with his Gib, guy in the back, First Lieutenant Jerry K. Sharp. He salvoed 2 Sparrows. The second Sparrow caught the MiG just forward of its stabilizer and blew up. 2 down. The sky was now filled with a mixture of F-4s using their tremendous energy in vertical climbs and dives, and the MiGs circling to take advantage of their great maneuverability. Olds 4, flown by Captain Walter Radiker III, with First Lieutenant James E. Murray III in the back, targeted a MiG tracking Olds 3. Radiker experienced some difficulty getting a solid tone on a Sidewinder, the tone of a growl that signals the missile was ready to fire. Yet the missile guided perfectly, striking just forward of the MiG's tail and sending it spinning into the undercast. 3 MiGs down. The next MiG fell to Captain Everett Raspberry and First Lieutenant Robert Western in Forward 2. 2 MiGs had closed on Forward 3 and 4, overshot, then pressed an attack on Forward 1, overshooting him as well. The MiG broke into a hard left turn, and Raspberry rolled to wind up on the MiG's 6 o'clock position. He fired a Sidewinder that guided up at the MiG's tailpipe, blowing it up. 4 down. Rambler Flight had arrived exactly on time to find itself in the midst of a MiG melee. One of the most important of the planners, Captain John B. Stone, was flying with Lieutenant Clifton Dunnigan Jr. as the backseater. Over Fuck-Yen, Stone picked up 2 MiGs 4,000 feet below and 2 miles away. Uncertain of his lock-on, Stone fired 3 Sparrows. The second missile impacted at the MiG's wing root, and the pilot ejected. 5 down. 2 young first lieutenants, Aircraft Commander Lawrence Glenn and pilot Lawrence Carey in Rambler 2, had been on Rambler's lead's wing all through its combat maneuvers. Just after Rambler 1 scored, Glenn locked on to a MiG-21 and fired 2 Sparrows. The second missile blew up the MiG, and debris damaged Rambler 2 slightly. The enemy pilot's parachute was seen to open. 6 down. The last victory went to Major Phil Combes in Rambler 4. and flying with Lieutenant Lee Dutton in the back seat. After Dutton had locked on, Combes tracked the MiG-21, and fired 2 Sparrows. The second missile impacting in the tail section, Combes later speculated that the pilot must have ejected when he saw the missile coming, for a parachute was seen almost immediately. 7 down. Combes and Major Herman Knapp in Rambler 3 each claimed a probable as well. Suddenly, the MiGs were gone, and the 4 remaining Wolfpack flights, Lincoln, Tempest, Plymouth, and Vespa, arrived to find the game gone to ground. Operation Bolo was over. Colonel Olds taxi in at Ubon, Thailand, with his canopy open, hands upraised in a gesture of victory to the cheering crowd of maintenance personnel. After months of hardship and disappointment, Olds had led the 8th to a spectacular victory. 7 kills and no losses. Suddenly, there was something to fight for, the Wolfpack itself. 7th Air Force was elated with the Wolfpack's results. 12 F-4Cs had engaged 14 MiGs and shot down 7 of them with no losses. It was worth noting that the 14 crew member who scored victory, only one, Lieutenant Lawrence Glenn, had ever seen a MiG in the air before. Olds had seen MiGs at a distance. Olds had proved that the F-4C was clearly superior to the MiG-21 in a dogfight. 18 Sparrows had been launched, of which only 9 guided, but these nailed 4 MiGs. 12 Signers were launched. 7 guided correctly, and 3 MiGs were destroyed. Perhaps more important than anything else in terms of morale and unity, the battle proved beyond a shadow of a doubt the importance of the largely unsung guy in the back who locked the radar onto the targets and who, despite continuously changing G-forces, kept his head on a swivel, watching out for enemy aircraft and SAMs. Many of the Gibbs, guys in the back, would get a reward, flying in the front seat of an F-4 on another combat tour. Olds never doubted the importance of the Gib and unfailingly gave them credit for their actions. The battle proved Olds to his men for all time, not only as a commander who could execute a plan, but also as a leader who took his men into combat, waxed the enemy, and led them out again. Olds made sure that everyone who participated in Operation Bolo, whether it was on the ground or in the air, was given full credit for their contributions. Bolo gave a lift in morale to the entire Air Force, and it was just the start for Olds. Welcome to the Doomed to Repeat podcast. Number 3, Aces in Command by Walter Boyne. I first read this book when I was a young captain in the squadron. I saw it at a bookstore in New Bern, North Carolina, and it was a bargain book, so I grabbed it, picked it up, read it. Unbeknownst to me, there was a lot of cool lessons in it. I got a lot of lessons out of it, but as I got older and just reread it recently, looking back on my own career, there was more wisdom to be mined. Just like any great book, they become timeless. As you get in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, there are different lessons in each season of your life, every chapter of your life. So I want to share some of these with you that I've looked back upon, so we can take this knowledge and improve ourselves to be the ace in our individual level, the ace at your group level, your team level, and the ace in your organizational level. We all want to improve. We want to be that better version of ourselves than we were yesterday. Cool. So the author, Walter Boyne, retired colonel. He was a World War II and Vietnam era pilot, kind of a bomber upbringing. But more importantly, he's written over 50 books and over 1,000 articles. And he's one of de facto historians of not just Air Force aviation history, but aviation history globally. One thing's for sure, they were all disciplined, and disciplined in the top 10% way. A lot of organizations, high-performing organizations, top 300 companies, they hire and select very disciplined people in the Marine Corps, flight school, and all that, and recon or SEAL training, you already have a pretty high performing group anyway. But out of that high performing group, you're still competing, you know, you're still competing. So everyone is disciplined, but all these gentlemen had a heck of a lot more discipline than the majority of them. They were in the top, 10% of the discipline category. They all worked hard. They were hard workers, worked with their hands. They weren't afraid to get the hands dirty, and they were all rebellious. All of them had this trait of rebellion, and really, you become a rebel in a very structured environment if you're creative. And that's the fourth thing they have in common. They all were creative. They all wrote. They all wanted to share their hard-earned wisdom for free. And they were all outspoken. You're never going to get anywhere if you keep things to yourself. You've got to be outspoken, and you've got to, it goes beyond standing up for yourself. It goes into the realm of being a change agent in an organization. And they were all that, change agents, because they were outspoken. So what is an ACE? For those of you that, tuning in and want to learn about these military subjects, and again, we're going to go over different subjects. I'm not going to stick with war and death and destruction and man mastering machines. So we're going to hit other stuff too. But so over the years, and I was thinking about it, I've read this book several times. There's some warrior symbols that keep coming on. The knight or the samurai, right? The laconic gun-toting cowboy, and the cocky, aggressive fighter pilot ace. So in our, I guess, Western culture, and especially American culture with the cowboy, these are the images that we see. So an ace is a pilot actually who destroys 5 enemy aircraft. It used to be 3 in the German air services in 1914 through 15, but they changed the requirement to 5, and that's kind of where it was born. I mean, aviation had just come around. This is just after the turn of the century, right? There is an ace myth, though, right? That loner, that singular lone wolf on the prowl, separated from his own pack. Nothing could be further from the truth. All these aces, all these top performers in any squadron, if you're going to be successful in the squadron, that lone wolf mentality doesn't work. You're eventually weaned away from the pack and the tribe. They're all team-oriented. They're all selfless. And when not flying, extremely competitive. Competitive at everything. Competitive at pool. Competitive at physical fitness tests. Competitive playing basketball. Competitive at drinking at the club on Friday nights. Been there, done that. But they're all competitive, competing against their peers, right? So that the myth is that, that lone wolf maverick on Top Gun. And oh, by the way, they're having a remake of Top Gun 2. So just to give you some perspective, out of the hundreds of thousands of pilots who have flown fighters, only 1% have flown in combat. Of that 1% of fighters who've been in combat, less than 5% during the ACE era, less than 5% became aces. It is truly an elite group of pilots at the top of their game. What set them apart? Well, there's been a lot of studies on commonalities and trying to guess who's going to be the ace or in that category, but they're all kind of inconclusive, according to the book. But these traits, they can be used in any endeavor. Again, you're going to be the ace of the base. You're going to be the ace in your company. You're going to be the ace in your company is going to be the ace of companies in your industry. Hell yeah. So the ace window basically was 1915 to 1972. The Germans and the Allies needed some good news about the public about the war in World War I. That's when this all came about, right? The war in the trenches was horrible. I mean, we went over the podcast number 2, World War I, and it was dismal. The conditions were dismal. There is no good news except death and destruction and misery and disease. So the Germans they kind of started the social media campaign and pitted two of their pilots against each other in a competition. One was an outgoing team player, Oswald Bulkey, who was selected and trained and developed fellow pilots, and he was also social and outgoing team player. His nemesis, the introverted Max Immelman, who was a vegetarian, did not like to drink, was kind of on his own personal journey with the enemy. He had, he was a Prussian, so Prussian tradition forbade officers seeking personal glory. So he kind of was put out in the spotlight, but subconsciously and consciously kind of shot away from it. They're both up to flying together, and they both went out solo. They were used to promote cigarette ads and whatnot, and propaganda, newspapers, greeting cards, anything to exploit the newfound fame, to kind of take the spotlight from the trenches into these flying knights, right? So that was kind of the World War I mentality. The British followed suit, and the Americans soon after. Remember, the French and the Germans started in the beginning, and then the British came in 1916-ish, and the Americans flying, we came in a little bit earlier than the ground, or I say we, earlier than the ground troops did, but we had pilots and machines flying before the ground troops came in 1918, or 1917 and 1918. Americans followed their pilots like they did their baseball players. Immelman had 15 kills. The Americans followed their pilots like they followed their baseball players. And we're going to talk about Eddie Rickenbacker, who was already a well-known public figure at the time. Immelman had 15 kills, and he was killed in combat. Bulkey was at 40 kills when he was killed in midair when his wingman collided in midair with him. The kill score was originally 7, then reduced to 5. Depending on the source, it was 3 first when the Germans first started, and they made it 5, and then it went up to 7, and then back down to 5. Baron Manfred von Richthofen was credited for 80 kills. It was probably a lot more than that. Those were confirmed. The German numbers were a little bit more accurate because most of the flights happened over German lines. In other words, they kept better records, and they saw the fight there. They were confirmed by other aircraft, balloons, and ground personnel. Yeah, what the Germans did was they made the fight come to them, kind of aggressive in a way. You want to come, mix it up with the flying circus, then you come over our lines and come find us. They had the advantage in the beginning. But eventually the Allies had more machines in the air, and by a long shot. So the greatest aces of all time, going back to the whole ace window, 1915, I talked about the beginning of it in the inception, was the Blonde Knight of Germany. And we're going to go over him too because he's an awesome character. Blonde Knight of Germany, Major Erich Hartmann. He had 352 kills. Gerhard Barkhorn had 302 kills. The Soviets had some in the 60s, and 2 women aces, Lydia Litviak and Yekaterina Bunanova, had 12 and 11 victories respectively. So the Soviets had some women in the air. They had some women snipers too. Okay, there seems to be no predictor, despite hundreds of studies. According to Colonel Boyne, there are hundreds of studies of what makes a good ace. But from the book and from stories from pilots that you can read about who were aces, we're going to take a look at 3 of them and see what they had in common. So Eddie Rickenbacker from World War I, Frederick Boots Blessey, he flew in Korea and Vietnam, and then the famous Colonel Robin Olds from World War II and Vietnam. So they all had a lot of things in common. They all, they were flyers, but honestly, looking at, our ethos in the Marine Corps is, hey, you're a Marine officer first and happens to fly airplanes, right? They were kind of in that same mold. They were all about their job and making their team better. And oh, by the way, they flew airplanes and were freaking great at it. But they all had this thing. They all wanted to be the first leader. They wanted to take care of their men. They wanted to teach and mentor their fellow pilots. So they were leader first, taking care of your men and supporting units, and then teacher and mentoring fellow pilots. All very highly disciplined, all hardworking and long hours, and just made no excuses. So we're going to start World War I with Eddie Rickenbacker. So this guy, he was thought of as a slacker because he didn't have a job until he was 10 years old. This is turn of the century, okay? He woke at 2 a.m. and walked 2 miles to pick up papers in Columbus, Ohio. He delivered them to houses for a cool $1 a week to help his family out. He hung out with Horsehead Gang, so he's a little gangster as a little kid. He hung around the racetrack. So you think he learned some skills with these guys around the racetrack? Some social networking skills? Some survival skills? Yeah, heck yeah, he did. And not only that, as a wolf in a pack. So he was already, as a young adolescent, he's already running with a pack. But he learned how to thrive on the streets. He was hardworking, little rotten kid. The family was from Switzerland and from German descent, Rickenbacker. His father was a construction and worked extremely hard and very long hours. They were poor, had a German accent, and ill-fitting clothing. So back in these days, I mean, the immigrants were looked down upon, and they were not well treated at all. So again, you got to toughen up, be tough. That adversity creates tough people. He actually had a pair of shoes, but they were two different types of shoes, and he was always dressed in tattered clothes and always being taunted constantly. But again, immigrants were mistreated back then, and they still are, quite frankly, a lot of them. Discipline back then was swift and quick, considering child abuse to his standards. So William, the father, stressed getting shit done now and get it complete, young Eddie. And, these lessons for a kid that age, I mean, they're taking him in. They don't acknowledge him, but they take him in, and he was out with his gang anyway. But his mom, on the other side, it was a good blend of harshness and discipline from his dad and real world stuff, survival stuff. But his mom was very close to God, and that rubbed off on all the kids. And so Elizabeth also was very creative, and that rubbed off on him too. So he got to see both sides of it. When Eddie was 13, his father got into an argument on the job site. So this other construction worker basically beat him to death with one of those old wooden levels. He was in a coma for 3 days, and back then, I mean, it's just these things just happen. So guess what? Eddie, not even being the oldest of his siblings, he becomes the breadwinner. He goes from rotten troublemaker, gangster, hardworking gangster to the breadwinner. And who, by the way, he's 14 years old. He dropped out of the 7th grade and got a job at the Federal Glass Factory in Columbus. So he worked the night shift. He'd get up and he'd get there at 6 p.m. and work till 6 a.m. And he was very good with his hands. He had people skills from being in the gang. And he found himself in progressively higher paying jobs that had a little bit more responsibility. And as a teenager, he ended up being some kind of a foreman in the factory. But his artistic ability from his mom and his skills with his hands from his dad, he won praises with his bosses, and he got the job done, right? So he does that, and in 9 years, he went from pushing brooms in that factory and some iterations of different things to racing a car, in those days making $60,000 a year as a race car driver, which is about, put it in perspective, this is, pre-World War I, it's like $1 million a year. The kid is making $1 million for his family. He's doing all this. At an early age, but now, so he doesn't have education. He doesn't speak well. He takes out correspondence courses on engineering because he's into cars. He takes out in correspondence courses back in those days. You'd pay a little money, snail mail, it comes in, you get the little books, you read them, you take the test, whatever, and you get some kind of credit, like an equivalent of a community college credit. But he was doing this on his own. He knew his weaknesses and he was trying to improve them. So, but he always sought out mentors, right? So his social skills got him smart enough to know that he had to have someone to pull him up. So young Eddie Rickenbacker was just this awesome little teenager who grew up very, very fast. Didn't know anything different. Hard work, and that's what he's made out of. He learned some lessons in failure. One of his bosses, race car driver, he was like the A driver because he knew how to work on the engine. He had to maintain he had to keep an eye on the engine and make sure it didn't overheat and all that kind of stuff. And he was there to help make repairs if and when they crashed. And that's exactly what happened. The owner of the car, Lee Frayer of the Frayer Miller Racing Team, they had a big crash, destroyed the car. They hadn't seatbelts back in those days. But that race season, they had dumped 50,000 plus, so over almost $1 million in today's dollars, and they just lost everything. So his boss kind of shrugged it off, and there's another lesson. Hey, we learned from this, and it's no big deal. We're going to move on. We're not going to crash and burn. And these lessons would serve him well in France when he flew in combat. So he was eventually, he was very charismatic and eventually was offered a salary of $150 a month, more than doctors and lawyers made back in those days. This is after his $1 million salary days. Troubleshooting problems on the dealer floor for an auto company. But he was good with people. And again, he took more courses. He took Dale Carnegie courses. He was constantly self-improving. But now the war's on, and he wants to fly. The glamour of flying and the Lafayette Squadron, most of the pilots of the time were from Blue Blood. They were from Yale. They were moneyed. They were, again, the millionaires unit. Most of them came from very, very wealthy families at the time. And here's this guy who's a mechanic, race car driver, uneducated. He speaks street slang, and he's going into Yale Town. So he wasn't able to get into that niche, into flight school. So he was so frustrated trying to get into the mold, into flying, that he went back to the States after a trip in Europe. He was asked to come to Great Britain and race in Great Britain for a British company, Sunbeam Racing, and he turned it down. Came back to the States and he's like, had this great idea. Hey, I'm gonna get a bunch of mechanics together and we're gonna form up and we're gonna be able to fly for our country. Not so much. Didn't agree with the social status and didn't agree with, the type of men that they were looking to fly. So what does he do? He's like, I'm going to serve. I'm going to do something. He gives up his very high-paying job, right? He could race cars for $1 million a year again. He enlists in the Army. But he's a public figure, so people know who he is. He enlists in the Army as a sergeant, gives up his salary, his civilian salary, and makes, sergeant's pay. And I know what sergeant's pay is. It's not that much. And I can't imagine what it was back in 1917. So he does that. And he's trying to get in to flying. But what do they do with him? They make him a chauffeur. He's like, cool. Sergeant Rickenbacker, chauffeur. I can drive cars. I know more about this car than these people know about anything. So he grabs the opportunity and he becomes the driver for the commander of all of the American Air Forces. He becomes the driver for Billy Mitchell, the famous Billy Mitchell, who took B-25s off an aircraft carrier on a one-way trip to retaliate for Pearl Harbor. That Billy Mitchell. So in World War I, rewind, Billy Mitchell is in charge of all American aviation in France at the time. Cool. He had an opportunity. He took it. But he did everything. He didn't complain. He opened doors. He kept the car running. It kept it clean. It broke down, and he immediately went out and he knew what the problems were. He would drive fast and safe and got his officers where they needed to go. So he opened doors. Yes, sir, no, sir. 3 bags full. He did no complaining. He did his job to his utmost. So Billy Mitchell's driver, eventually, he got a nod to take the exam, to go get a flight physical. And he kind of schmoozed his way with the doctor. He had an eye problem. He had a blind spot in his left eye. He didn't have peripheral vision on this side, but he knew the doctor and kind of talked his way into getting passed. So they passed him. He lied about his age. At the time, he was 27. The cutoff was 25, and for them back then, that was old for a pilot. But again, he wasn't one of the boys. Now he's in a training unit, but he had a mentor. Billy Mitchell, Billy Mitchell, got him in at least to get into flight school, and he sought out. He sought out the leaders that he knew that he could trust to get him to the next level, because he was going to fly. He was hell-bent on flying. And not only flying, he wanted to be the first American ace, and he wanted to be the highest ranking American ace. He wanted to be the ace of aces. That was his goal. So from chauffeur to flight school. But now America doesn't have a lot of equipment. We have bodies, we have flyers, but we don't have a lot of airplanes and equipment. That was just it. The French and the British manufactured the preponderance, up to 75% of the airplanes, and when the Americans came in mass, there wasn't even an airfield. So when they got the unit together, they had to construct the airfield. They had to construct the barracks, put in water, electricity, and all this. And Eddie knew how to lead people from his factory days, from all of his days. And he went and became the hands-on guy, one of the hands-on guys to build the American base up. So that's exactly what he did. And his commander, Major Carl Toohey Spatz, was a hard-nosed leader, but he understood where Eddie was, but Eddie got things done. Eddie was all about getting done. Dirty-handed leadership. He was out there helping build this freaking airfield and get the unit up and running. It was muddy in the fields of Issoudun, France, and eventually became a proper flying base in a couple of months. So his peers looked down upon that kind of stuff, obviously. Fellow flyers, that's beneath him. But he's like, hey, man, get the job done. Go. And he had mentors. When he did start flying, he befriended American Major Raoul Lufberry. Now, Lufberry, French and American, French-born, he went to America, kind of had a lot of world experience, traveled the world before he actually joined the Army Air Corps. And he became the highest scoring ace for France, but was also an American, and he commanded a squadron. So, well-known, Lufberry took, he actually, he saw what Eddie was about, and Eddie glommed onto him as a mentor. And according to the book, Eddie Rickenbacker learned more about flying with his first couple of months with Lufberry. It carried with him for his entire flying career. So on October 12, 1916, Lufberry became the first American ace. And Eddie definitely sought him out, as he did Billy Mitchell, as he did his race car drivers. But it's not schmoozing. I mean, all that, there's the big lesson in there. A lot of people go around their life thinking, I'll do it myself. There's no self-made people out there. You have to have mentors. You have to seek out mentors. And guess what? Those people in position to be a mentor, they'll be able to pull you up to the next level. Because without their help, I mean, you're going to stay stagnant. Because what got you to where you're at right now isn't going to get you to the next level. So seeking out a mentor is so important and so smart. And he knew this. He knew this from an early age. He probably learned it as a gang member when he's 12 and 13 years old. Horsehead gang. So Luff taught him to know his wingman's ability and be concerned with their safety. Big, selfless leadership by example. Don't worry about yourself first. Worry about the guy you're leading around first, making sure that he is ready to go and know his abilities so you don't put him in a position where he can't handle it. Eddie, again, he wrote, and he's very adamant. He learned more from Lufberry about leadership, flying, and being an ace than anybody. So getting through now they're through the training, the first combat mission over to the squad, first combat mission for the American squadron after all this training and all this angst, right, to get them to kind of finally fly in the war. It came on March 28th, 1918. Like the ground forces, they got there, they were there. Lufberry was flying combat missions, but he took, on the very first day, on the very first mission, Major Lufberry took 2 wingmen, Lieutenant Rickenbacker and Lieutenant Douglas Campbell. So studies have shown back in World War I that becoming an ace is one of survival. If you made it through the first 5 missions, your chances of survival will increase by a factor of 20. So you had to survive to see. Those who made it to the next level was at the 6-month mark. Then combat fatigue would set in. If you were injured or taken out of combat, you got a respite. Eddie got that with an ear infection. Not only probably saved him, but allowed him to become the ace of aces. So again, Eddie's 3 goals were to get the first kill. That didn't happen. Become the first ace and have the highest score. But let's go back to, to making past your first 5 days and then make it to the 6-month mark. So every time you fly in combat, first mission, it's kind of everything's like in a soda straw. You don't have a lot of bandwidth, a lot of peripheral taking everything in. Your senses are way up there. The second mission, you get a little bit more bandwidth. The soda straw becomes more like a conduit, a pipe, right? Third mission, a little bit bigger and bigger. So you got to make it through that first 5 missions or 5 days to be able to see. Because when Lufberry took them both out, there was some ground fire. There was some, they were being fired at from the ground, not only from small arms, but artillery. And Eddie didn't see it. He came back, and Lufberry was like, "Oh, glad you guys barely made it back." He said, "What do you mean?" And he went around, and Lufberry took them around their airplanes, and he showed them where all the shrapnel holes were and the bullet holes, which were very close to their bodies. So they didn't even see them. That was a big eye-opener. So once you make it past that first 5 days, then now you can be a killing machine, and you're going to go up there. But at the 6-month mark, fatigue sets in. You're just flying combat missions, and you get complacent. Statistically, you'll get complacent and do something wrong, or you're just fatigued. So 6-month mark, Eddie gets an ear infection. He fights it, though. It's not like, "Oh, I'm sick. No, he really tries to take the pain. But when you're talking about the inner ear, you're talking about getting vertigo, and when you're flying and these old rickety things, I mean, yeah, he absolutely had to go to the hospital. So he got some respite. He went to the hospital, got operated on. But that window that he was gone, almost 2 months, he was able to reflect on the wisdom and the mistakes and the successes he made. And he thought about it and wrote it all down, and was able to come back refreshed and ready to go for the next go and actually survive the war. Most didn't do that. Most went right through that 6 month mark, and if you survived, you survived. But it's toward the end of the war. The Germans, both World War I and World War II, when they went to war, they stayed. They stayed there. That's how they were. You know, the Blonde Knight of Germany was able to rack up 300 plus kills because they were there for the duration. They didn't have 100 missions or 125 missions and then go home. They were there for the duration. So he wanted to be the first. He wanted to get first kill. He wanted to become an ace, and he wanted to have the highest score. But he wanted to lead the squadron with a high level of excellence because he's already seen it. I mean, he learned these lessons as a teenager in the glass factory. That's why he was promoted. He learned it as a race car driver. He learned these lessons when he was, on the car dealership floor. So he brought all that hard-earned wisdom to the squadron, because if the machine isn't working, i.e. the organization is not working, you're not going to be able to be an ace, right? So flying, he got 2 victories, but still had a hard time gaining respect of his fellow pilots because of his actions, his language. I mean, we're talking about a bunch of Yaleys and Harvard heroes, right? Just didn't fit in, didn't play football. When there was a passage in there on Sundays and during flight training when Lufberry was commander of the whole flight, wing. He, instead of playing football with all the Yaleys and whatnot, he would go fly. And he would fly over the football field, get extra hours, put in the extra time, a little bit more discipline. So he wasn't in odds with them, but he wasn't one of them. And that, but he had enough wisdom and, fortitude that really didn't bother him. It probably fueled him, quite frankly. But he went with the flow, he drank socially with them, laughed at their jokes, do whatever. But they're a unit, a cohesive unit. But there was one certain Lieutenant Hall, and he was well liked and from an aristocratic family, and he flew with Eddie and treated him with respect and treated him like everyone else. So he was kind of one of the informal leaders of the squadron. So him respecting Eddie and his ways, kind of everyone else would follow suit. So it wasn't, don't get me wrong, it wasn't the adversarial relationship in the squadron, but that's kind of what he was dealing with at the time. Little human dynamics, But it kept Eddie keep Eddie in the limelight until he become an ace. So he was able to continue to fly. And obviously, when you're in an organization like that and you don't quite fit in, but you're competent, people still learn from you. They won't give you the credit give you the credit, but they still know that you're a good pilot or a good salesman or a good mechanic or a good welder, and they can count on you. So Lufberry is the squadron commander, and again, the leadership. I mean, he's well known. He's a public figure, great pilot. He goes past his 6 months, right past his 6 months, and dies, basically robbing the squadron of leadership. And now Eddie loses his mentor. So they made Eddie Rickenbacker a flight leader. Now, in the early days of aviation, a lot of them didn't want to be flight leads. They wanted to make sure that they survived and took care of themselves. And it's easier to take care of yourself than, again, worrying about your wingman. Now, when I was in a squadron, that was your main concern. Your wingman was your main concern. Everything he does or fails to do is your responsibility as a flight lead. So you really had to mentor the youngsters in the squadron. So Campbell's kill was confirmed first, and then Rick's. But he was now an ace at last. He finally became an ace after Lufberry dies. But the squadron is going downward. Their leadership isn't there. And the way their story reads and accounts for the 94th Squadron, when they lost Lufberry, they lost their way. Performance waned, and they lost their aggressiveness. So leadership is everything. You got to have a good leader. I mean, these are, very, very high risk aircraft, and it's in combat, and you're going against a very competent enemy. So whether it was by design or they saw the need to put the 94th in this quieter place, Rick got sick. He had an ear infection, and he was also, again, he tried to continue to fly. He got some minor treatment with some results, but then he flew again and blew out his ear. So equilibrium, eyesight, all that combined, he was taken out of the fight. And this probably saved his life. In the hospital, he basically broke it up into 2 tours. His first 6 months, and then his second tour when he came back after being hospitalized. But again, fitness, fatigue, and business. Okay, same things. You can grind in your business, and you can grind out in the oil field, and you can, burn both ends of the candle. And I'm telling you, eventually it takes a toll. You can maintain that. You can maintain a high tempo operations, whether you're flying or whether you're on the ground or you're in a factory. You can, work your crews 612s. That's hard to do, and that's hard to maintain. If you want to make a lot of money and get all that overtime, that's fine, but it does take a toll. Accidents go up. Safety wanes. People start missing things. Same thing. So here, he was lucky. It wasn't by design. He got a break, and he was able to reflect, decompose, decompress, and come back fresher. Even the battalions and squadrons that went in and out of Iraq, they were there for 7 months. They'd get there, they'd train pretty much all year, get there on the ground, there for 7 months, and then back home. Sustained combat operations. But if you're physically fit, you can handle it. And even in your lifestyle, you can handle it. And even Eddie Rickenbacker, when he was back in the hospital, he had a rule when he was racing cars. He says, I'm not going to drink 24 hours before I get into the car. But when he was in the squadron, getting along with his squadron mates, his teammates, they would drink regularly, socially, then go fly. He made it a point that when he got back to the squadron, that he wasn't going to drink 24 hours before, which meant he went, maybe weeks, because they flew every day. Weeks without drinking. So fitness, lifestyle, if you're going to burn at both ends, you can do it for a period. And everyone's different. Everyone has a different stress threshold, both mentally, emotionally, and physically. Your stress threshold changes as you're able to take on more stuff. But you need a period of decompression. And he was given that. So now he's back in the fight. He comes back, and now they're in a period of the war, the Battle of Saint Mihiel, where they're doing not air-to-air, the glamour stuff, but the dangerous air-to-ground strafing, the ground troop stuff, getting into the flak, into the small arms fire, and dropping bombs and doing strafing runs. So he proved that he wanted to do that. He came back and he started leading flights into the breach and doing the air-to-ground stuff when the others they did it, but they were reluctant to do it. So in a risky but wise move, the new wing commander, this Major Hartley, he was bird-like but wise, according to the book. He made Rick the commanding officer of the 94th, and he's a sergeant. He was unliked by some of the pilots, but he knew the aircraft engines. He knew those engines back and forth. He spent time with the maintenance crews. From the time he was in training there, he spent time with the maintenance crews. He had an affinity with the mechanics and the enlisted men. The squadron immediately shaped up, but the weight of command, and they flew more missions than anyone else. He was promoted to commanding officer above way more senior pilots. Okay? But again, the wing commander saw that, hey, we need to pull him up and do that. He didn't know him from Adam, but he knew his reputation. And that wing commander got a lot of heat. He got a lot of heat from his fellow officers and then higher headquarters back in the States. Rick is not officer material. We can't make him an officer. Well, so that was, he got command at 3 o'clock. And on 8 o'clock, he got with all the mechanics first. And he charged them with getting 100 hours, because every 30 hours at the time, those engines had to be overhauled. So you've got all these aircraft down with the engines out, a lot of maintenance, very high workload, long hours. But he charged them. He knew the aircraft. He knew the mechanics. He knew what they were made of to get those engines at 100 hours before an overhaul. He knew it could be done. And with his leadership and his ability to, use his creativity and salesmanship, he sold it to the maintenance crew. Boom. And they maintain that standard 100 hours per overhaul, 100 hours on each engine before an overhaul, where the standard was 30 before. And all the other squadrons are still doing 30. So that kind of, it happens in military squadrons. Sometimes, most times, maintenance leads the squadron to become successful, because you've got healthy aircraft and you've got maintainers that are competent, and you've got maintainers who are, no kidding, on the ball and motivated, and they have a mission and they have a purpose. You have all these available aircraft and all the equipment's working, and now you've got to fill these aircraft with pilots. Now operations can fill the schedule up with very creative, robust training schedules, and pilots fly more, the airplanes fly more. That's how it works. So that was 8 o'clock. At 9 o'clock, he got the pilots together. He said, hey, I'm tired of this saluting. We're not going to salute anymore and such. We're teammates. We're here in this together. And officers, all the officers were to put everybody else ahead of themselves. In other words, getting down, knowing who the enlisted Marines were in their shops, in the maintenance barns and whatnot, and putting them first. Every man would also fly as often as aggressively possible, and they were going to lead every other squadron in victories to kill Germans. That was their mission. It was a short meeting, and then they woke up that next morning, his first day as a commander, first full day. He goes out and he scores 2 victories, shoots down 2 Germans. First day in command. He's walking the walk. What do you think that does to a squadron? They lost their way. They lost their king. They lost their leader, Lufberry, right? He got to recharge, regroup. He didn't ask to be the squadron commander. He was a sergeant. And they made him the squadron commander. So he's walking the walk. He communicated what he expected from his maintenance crew, and that grew into, hey, more available aircraft. Pilots don't have to not fly. They're going to fly a lot more. Boom, done. So he had to fight to get in flight school. He had to fight to get in combat. He was forced out of combat to reflect. That saved his life. So, lessons from here. He led from the front. He communicated his expectations to his team and made the 94th not the laughingstock, but the best squadron in the wing. And it was because of his leadership and his lessons. So, recognize when you need a break. He was lucky. He was forced out. He couldn't have flown with that ear issue. In business, take a look back. Lead by example and lead from the front. The only way you're really going to get proficient at anything is by doing it. If your job is to be a pilot in a squadron, or you're the operations manager or the logistics manager, you better know every aspect of the job, every bolt on the assembly line, or every widget in the tracks that come from the trucks and go up there. You need to know, your people know, not as in depth as they know, but you have to understand it. You have to understand it to know how to lead them and to make the right decisions. He knew, because he had been working with the mechanics, that you could get 100 hours on those engines. But you had to do these certain things. And he probably knew what those certain things were to get 100 hours on the engines, because the mechanics were on board. They made it happen. If he went in there and says, we're going to get 200 hours on it, it would have been unrealistic. And the mechanics would look at each other and look on the floor and say, yes, sir, and not perform and stay at the 30 hours or maybe get the 60 hours. But leading from the front, first day as a CO, he already had kills. But the first day as a CO wakes up and gets 2 more kills. That's freaking awesome. Fit in and get along. To get what you want, you've got to get along with your team. You don't have to necessarily like them. You have to eke out their capabilities and the good stuff, and kind of marginalize the bad stuff, but do it in a way that's subtle. Use just amount of force to enable discipline. You don't use the sledgehammer and crush somebody every single time they make mistakes. Subtle hints, just is the minimal amount to get the message across. But he got along as a driver. I was kind of slap in the face. Oh yeah, Rickenbacker, he's a famous millionaire driver. We're going to make him a chauffeur and mechanic. But he did it. He was the best chauffeur and mechanic. And then the maintenance officer, construction foreman, getting the base together, did that. And then leading from the front. Surviving and getting kills beforehand, but leading from the front. Coming back and turning the 94th Squadron into a premier squadron and bringing back their honor after losing Lufberry. Because it was a dismal time from the time Lufberry died until the time Rickenbacker got back. It was a pretty dismal time in the squadron. So yeah, no kidding. Fit in, get along. That was his strength. But he knew, and he studied, and he had initiative, and he just studied and studied and studied. Instead of playing football on a Sunday in combat zone in wartime, he would go get extra flight time. He had the desire to be the best, desire to make the team better, and desire to lead and teach. But ultimately, he had just super discipline. So, fast forward to Major Boots Frederick Bless. A little bit different than our young strapping Eddie Rickenbacker from the Horsehead Gang. So Major Frederick Boots Bless, actually Blessy, Major Boots Frederick Blessy. Blessy said a little prayer after his 5th kill in Korea. He wanted nothing but to survive the day and to be an ace for a day. He prayed to God. He got his wish. He was in the service since 1945, and at the end of the war, and flew ill-maintained P-47s, Thunderbolts, which had a high accident rate. Let me start that over. Our next guy, Major Boots Frederick Blessy. Blessy's prayer. After his 5th kill, he wanted nothing but to survive the day and to become an ace just for a day. He got his wish. So unlike Rickenbacker, Blessy grew up in the Depression, but you wouldn't have known it because he didn't know it. It was a depression because his father was an Army surgeon, and he traveled around, and his father was well connected, and he was a career officer in the Army, and they lived on bases. They were unaffected by the depression. So he played sports. He swam. He ran track, individual sports, and he picked up golf. In golf, he became quite the scratch golfer and quite the, I'd say, renegade teenager, disciplined athlete. But golf, the self-discipline that Blessy had as a young man, like Rickenbacker, bled into his golf game. His rule was every time I go onto the links, and this is a teenager, he's 13, 14 years old, every time I go on the links I want to be better. And he had metrics on how he was going to be better that day than he was the day before. Right. So he grew up in the one of his father's last assignment was in the Philippines, where in the Philippines, and he was a 16-year-old, now going to high school. It was so hot back then that they didn't have air conditioning in the school, so he'd go to school from 7 in the morning until 12 right after lunch. And then he'd go on the links and he'd golf every day. And he made friends with a lot of the young lieutenants who were flying on the base there. So he got some flight time too. He got to befriend these younger pilots and their families. And he had these, so not only his father was there as a mentor for the military or whatnot, he had all these young men who were great role models and great mentors for him. So that was a boon for him in his upbringing. It was reinforced the skills that he already had. As a matter of fact, in 1938, he played a round of golf with the famous Gene Sarazen, who broke the Philippine golf course record at 65. Bless, he was only 16. He was only 2 strokes behind him at 67. It was an exhibition game. At the time, Sarazen, if you know about golf history, I didn't before this, he was, Masters champion, whatnot, and the top 1% of golfers. Not the Tiger Wood of his day, but close to Tiger Wood. So he posed him the question again, seeking out a mentor. Hey, I love golfing. I have plans to go to West Point. Gene, what do you think I should do? Should I pursue golfing or should I go to West Point? He's like, easy. You go to West Point and you use your golf game as a social tool to learn about your people, and not only learn about your people to get what you want in your career. So go to West Point, keep golfing. Don't think about the professional side of it. So that's exactly what he did. But at the time, 16, he's doing as well as a world champion golfer. So he's flying, he's getting mentorship, he's disciplined, he's improving his golf game, and he's going to West Point, so he thinks. So he got to the exam portion, the physical exam portion, and he failed because he had some spots on his lungs. Now, his dad is a doctor. You'd think that maybe he had something to do with it. I don't think so. So he's like, heck, maybe I should have done this golf thing. So he enrolls for his freshman year at the University of Denver in 1940. But golf in the Philippines had matured him, and he had advanced social skills that would carry him well. The social skills that Rickenbacker learned were kind of different than the high-level aristocratic blue blood officer world skills that got him to mature. So in 1942, he was accepted to West Point finally, but he had to do his own work on that. He had to troll the halls of Congress to find a congressman to sponsor him. So at that time, the wars here, and they lower the standards. So now the spots on his lungs aren't that big of a deal. So he does, and he gets to West Point. And the accelerated schedule at West Point was challenging. So he again, discipline. He knew what he was doing. He wanted to fly, and he wanted to graduate West Point and get to the war. So he put golf on the back burner and just crammed it. Because at the time, West Point went from 4-year degree to a 3-year degree. So you had to be out in 3 years to get the West Point graduates out to the war. And he was selected to fly. So he got into flight school while he was at West Point, and his relationship with his flight instructors were solid, with his teammates were solid, and he got his wings and commission in 1945. And now he's ready to become an ace, going to war. But guess what? War ended before he got there. So he got to his first duty station after getting checked out in P-40s. He eventually flew P-51s as well, but that's another story. So He gets to Okinawa. The war just ended, but we still have flying units over there. But the drawdown is so drastic. The aircraft are so ill maintained. The accident rate is extremely high, and it's extremely dangerous to fly training missions. But he's a flyer. He's a West Point graduate. He's a career officer who's flying these Thunderbolts that were in, when they're well maintained, they're an awesome machine to fly. So, and it's the latest model because it's the end of the war. But he also flew P-40s, and just to give you an idea of what the squadron accident rates were like, they had 19 pilots in the squadron. 15 had bailed out of an airplane at least once, and several bailed out twice, and a couple had bailed out 3 times. He had a lot of close calls with the aircraft, bailing out in the nick of time one time when he bailed out of the aircraft. P-40's going into the ocean. His boots hit the water as soon as the parachute opened. Shark-infested waters. He's picked up by a fisherman who's wondering why he actually survived. So there's no golfing on Okinawa. There's no women. The bad food, the aircraft, and the flying is dangerous. But he took every opportunity. And as a pilot in the squadron, you want to always be that guy in the ready room, ready to fly right then as much as you possibly can. And he was that guy. He wanted to fly faster. He wanted to fly as much or more than any of his peers, again, because he's competitive. There's that competitive gene again. But it's a 2-year tour, and it was the 413th Squadron. And 2 years of constant flying and just not very good living conditions. But the P-80 was the first operational jet that the America had, and it was coming to the island. And he had about 2 months left on his 2-year assignment there in Okinawa. He wanted to fly the jet. He's just like, I want to fly this jet. And the CEO had, no, I'm only letting pilots that are going to be here for 5 months fly the jet, because you're not just going to get 10 hours in a jet and go back to the States. He wanted them to be there for a while so they could, reap the benefits. So he's like, all right, fine. Any pilot that wants to stay on this miserable rock for an extra you want to extend 5 months, then I'll let you fly the jets. He rose his hand. He got 35 hours in the P-80, got checked out in it. He also self-checked out in the P-51 Mustang, right? Because he's that guy. And even when his 2 months came up, the CEO was like, all right, you can go back to the States. A lot of times CEOs, and they still do it today, they'll throw something in front of you to get you to stay a little bit longer, because they just want to see who's hungry. They want to see who's got the ability to endure the pain before they give up, before they give up a good deal. So nothing wrong with that. It's a good leadership tool. All right, so now fast forward, he's got 30 hours in the jet. He goes back to the States, and he's stationed at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas. And there's all of a sudden, he's flying a lot of hours in the P-80 Sabre, and Korea kicks off. And oh, by the way, he's a training pilot. He's learning all these cool things about jets and jet fighter tactics and whatnot. But he's not the senior guy there anymore. He's like mid-level guy, even though he's a training officer. So he was told he had to wait for a combat assignment. And he's like, I can't wait. It's just like Rickenbacker back there. He's getting into the fight. He's got to fight his way. He's got to figure out a way to get to the fight. So he's at the bottom of the list to go to Korea. Even with his social skills, I don't understand that. So with the social skills, he still couldn't get into a jet flying unit going to Korea. But he's got time in the P-51 Mustang. So guess what? He's like, I'll go fly ground attack missions, because then there was a squadron over there that was flying ground attack. Again, not very glamorous, but the most important thing we do with aviation assets in any time in our history is to protect and support that 19, 20-year-old on the ground in the mud, slugging it out, and you support him with air power. You deliver packages on time, on target, plus or minus 5 seconds in close proximity of troops to destroy the enemy for that young 20-year-old, 23-year-old lieutenant and his men. So he's like, all right, you want to do that? Fine. I want to fly jets? Cool. Go fly P-51s, do some ground attack, drop some napalm, shoot some rockets and guns, the 50 cal. And the P-51 Mustang, awesome. So he gets there at 8 o'clock one night, I believe it was November 10th, in 1950. Yeah, November 10th, 1950, he gets there. And then he goes to sleep. He's woken up at 3 a.m. to do his first combat mission, pre-dawn launch, in a P-51. Now, in a P-51, the exhausts are in front. In the daytime, it's not a big deal. But at nighttime, there's fire coming out of the exhaust. You can see the fire. So, and this is pre-dawn, so it's dark. So he's lost his nighttime vision, and he's got to fly wing off of his lead. And this is the first time he's flown a P-51 in a long, long time. But he's smart. It's loaded down with napalm. It's loaded down with rockets, full guns, full ammunition. I mean, it's heavy, slow, not like the P-51 of old that you think about when you're a fighter pilot, right? Now it's a slow, heavy, ammunition-laden machine, and it's pouring down rain. It's pouring down rain, and his very first mission at 3 a.m., he gets out there. It's muddy. There's mud all over the place, so the aircraft is kind of slipping on the runway and whatnot. So his lead gets into position. He gets in position, fires up. He's thinking to himself, man, I just want to keep – you got to keep your eye on lead and stay next to your lead, okay, as you go up through the clouds. So they hit the clouds at like 500 feet, and they're in the clouds. They're in the goo at night for like 40 minutes until they break out on top. They break out on top and they do some ground attack missions, dropping napalm, rocket runs, gun runs, supporting the ground troops. Now they've got to come back and land. Well, the weather has deteriorated so much at their main base that they can't land there, so they have to go to a different base. And there's only 500-foot ceilings. They get down under the weather, and they eke their way onto the runway. Well, when he lands, there's a truck that's coming across in front of him, and he's just landing, and he's probably doing 100 knots, maybe 70 knots. And that truck just goes right across the runway, clips his wing. His aircraft tumbles over and over. Before he clipped the wing, though, he turned off the magnetos and the electrical circuits so the fuel wouldn't ignite. And he's a very competent pilot. He flew Thunderbolts post World War II in Okinawa, so he's got a very high caution, high safety, very safety cautious. In an interview with him, I heard on PBS, it saved his life. So he turned everything off. It cartwheeled down there. He saw the dirt in the runway come, and the aircraft flipped over, trapping him in the cockpit under an aircraft. Fuel's dripping on him and all that. So he's thinking, I'm going to die. So he was eventually dug out of that, and the airplane is destroyed even after that mission. And he's thinking, he's a career officer. He's just like, well, I'm gonna pay for this. This is going to go on my fitness report and my evals, and this is not good. Well, that day, because the weather was so bad and it was so important that the Army was supported no matter what, in 38 minutes, he was one of 7 aircraft that was crashed, but he survived. So that kind of tells you the sense of urgency that the Army Air Corps had at the time, or the Air Force had at the time. It was like past 1947. Air Force had at the time to support the ground troops because they were out there dying. Kill. So that was his first mission. And his first tour, he just did air-to-ground sorties, 70 air-to-ground sorties, and he worked with forward air controllers. Forward air controllers are actually pilots that go down with the ground troops and talk them in onto the targets. Forward air controllers are awesome. And he does this for a while. And now the Koreans at this time, he's doing these air-to-ground missions. They're flying MiG-15s, which is superior to the F-80, supposedly. In 7 November 1950, Lieutenant Russell Brown had down the first MiG in Korea. And Blessy's like, ugh, dang it. Again, he wanted to be the first ace. He wanted to be the top ace. So he's there in Korea towards the end of his, after 70 missions, and he's just like, well, now to get to the fight there, more people did that. So now there are more Mustang pilots than there are P-80 pilots. So he's like, I want to fly jets again. So he goes and flies a jet for 30-something more hours. And that was his first tour. He didn't see a MiG. He didn't even kill the MiG his first tour. But he's back in jets. He did all his ground missions. And there he was coming back to the States. He did 105 missions, and he's thinking, I'm never going to become an ace. Well, he was wrong. Same war, different airplane. He's now with the 94 Fighter Interceptor Squadron, commanded by Colonel Bud Morin, who had 25 kills to his name, and is the only pilot to have been shot down in Europe, the Pacific, and Korea. So 94th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, I didn't outline it in Rickenbacker, but that was Rickenbacker Squadron. So there's some layers here, right? He's a fighting commanding officer, and he's going to Korea, and he's taken 3 squadrons in his wing to Korea. But for some reason, Major Blessy is not picked to be in one of these squadrons. And I'm reading the book, and I'm trying to find out why. Maybe he had some personality conflicts. Don't know. But bottom line is he... the colonel, the wing commander, sees something in him, obviously, because he takes him with him. But he's not going to be in a squadron right away. He's going to be a maintenance officer. So he goes in the capacity of a maintenance officer because he couldn't get a job into the squadron. But when they get to Korea, their performance is not that great. And the colonel is not that happy with the leadership in his squadrons. They're not getting any MiG kills. The flying is not as aggressive. It's a defensive type of missions that they're flying, defensive type of tactics that they're using. And Major Blessy finally gets to do some flights, and the colonel takes him out. Colonel takes him out in the Super Sabre, and they see a MiG. And the colonel knows it's too far. Major Blessy doesn't think it's that far. So he goes after it, after he's been told not to. He takes a shot, and those 50 calibers on that jet actually slows the jet down, misses the MiG gets away. On the deck, he gets his ass handed to them by the wing commander. Don't do that again. You know that whole story. But guess what? They go to the club, have a beer, and shake it off. Make a mistake, learn from your mistakes, and move on. So he makes him the operation officer, and he's like, "Hey, it's your job to get this wing into shape. So you're this hot shot, make it happen, Captain." But he's like, "Okay, fine." Puts the plan together with some smart people, and he says, "Boss, we need to shut down combat operations for 1 week," and that's kind of unheard of. I mean, they're in combat, they're flying missions. And what his scheme was, in 1 week, he was going to take all the flight leads out, training them in aggressive tactics, and make sure that his flight leads knew, and they were going to come up with some rules too, and they did come up with some pretty stringent rules. Now, in the book, it seems like he comes up with the rules, but quite frankly, in that week, some of the better flight leads probably developed these rules with him. So it was an evaluation too. An evaluation for some of the flight leads. Ended up firing 2 flight leads that have 65 missions between the 2 of them, and neither one of them had ever seen a MiG. And he's just like, "Hey man, you're either unlucky or you're unwilling to fight. Either way, I can't afford you." So he got 2 young fire breathers to take their place. So they were hell bent on getting MiGs. That's the story. They're in the war, and they're fighting jets, and they've got to bring up their tally. So his philosophy during that week and from then on was intelligent survival. Be smart about what you're doing with your airplane to bring your wingman back home. but have brutal shark-like aggressiveness. So that was the theme from then on in the wing. And the 4 rules they came up with, and he was constantly, bless he, was constantly writing notes and papers and posting them into the ready room. And the ready room is where all the pilots gather and socialize or brief their flights before they go out. And that's where the duty officer is and all that. But he made his hard-earned wisdom public to everybody. He wanted to improve all the pilots' proficiency and performance. So he was constantly putting up notes and reminders and quotes up in the ready room. But the 4 new rules they came up with was flight leads could pick their wingman. Now, when I was in the squadron, you really couldn't pick your wingman. It was nice. I heard some squadrons do that, but I mean, think about it. You're on this team, and you've got probably 19 or 25 pilots in the squadron, and you should have the ability as a strong team to be able to fly effectively with everybody in the squadron. In other words, get along with everyone in the squadron, at least when you're flying. You don't have to get along or socialize on the ground or when you're off duty, but you should be professional enough to do that. But so that kind of, I scratched my head with that one. It could have an A team and a B team, and it just, that could make a lot of different. That could cause a lot of different challenges, if you might say, in a squadron. But anyways, that was one of them. Flight leads could pick their wingman, period. If a wingman lost his flight lead, he was grounded for a week. Now, a wingman losing his flight lead, the flight lead is not really, I mean, he's hell-bent on finding the MiGs and fighting the MiGs while his wingman is hanging on to his wing and staying on there for mutual support, right? It's up to the wing to stay on his flight lead's wing. So if he lost his flight lead, he's grounded for a week. And that led into the 3rd rule. If you got separated, now you're separated for whatever reason, it's a wingman's responsibility to stay together, and you couldn't get back together, you would go back to the base as singles, and you would sort it out later, but that wingman would be grounded for the next week. The 4th one was, if there's not a MiG engagement, if they don't get to engage MiGs, they come back early and they practice combat maneuvering, air-to-air combat, dogfighting amongst each other, the wingman and the flight lead, to hone their skills, because it is a perishable skill and it needs to be practiced constantly to be very, very good at it. But still, after that week, they didn't have any kills. Everyone is progressing, getting more comfortable with the new rules. And on May the 25th, 1952, boom, he got his first kill. And then he got a Piston LA-9 as a number 2. And he developed a list of rules that continuously was changing, but training his pilots. So again, he's posting these rules up on the board, and he's making not just the squadron, but the wing better. And over time, they did rack up a bunch of kills. By September, the wing had got 15. The wing has got, by September. So May he got his first kill. By September, the 334th had 17 kills. 5 of them were blessies. So again, leading from the front, probably flying a lot more than the rest of them. And he got 7 kills after extending for another 25 missions. So there he is. He's the ace. And again, his prayer was, with the day he got his 5th kill, God, just let me live through the day just so I could be an ace for the day. So he got that. So that was it. Through his leadership and through his reputation, he had to fight to get to jets. Once he got there, he had to fight to get to Korea, but he had a mentor, I guess. I mean, the wing commander saw something in him. He paid his dues as a maintenance officer, and then made his way into the squadron and came up with that 1-week plan to improve the tactics from a defensive nature and semi-lackadaisical to an offensive nature tactics, and just kind of changed the rules, and they evolved as they went along, and it produced results. So out of the 17 kills, he got 5, and he is an ace. He'd go on, he'd stay in the Air Force and have many assignments. He went to Vietnam. He flew 105 missions, all air to ground. Never saw a MiG there, never scoring a victory. He may have seen some MiGs, but he never scored a victory in Vietnam. He was responsible for the gun pods on the Phantoms and ensured maneuver warfare, manner of welfare for everyone on the base. He did make Major General, and he stayed in the Air Force until he retired in 1975 with over 6,500 hours of flight time, a Distinguished Service Cross, which is second to the Medal of Honor, 2 Silver Stars, 7 Distinguished Flying Crosses, a Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and then he went on to work for Northrop Grumman until he retired and died at the age of 91. So good life, but again, here he is, very, very competitive, extremely competitive, and very, he probably rubbed people the wrong way just reading through the book. Again, because if he was getting along and he knew, if a squadron commander knew of him and they wanted him in his squadron, he would have, he would have been asked or would have found a way to get him there. But the general, he's like, hey, man, I see something in you. Or, yeah, you're going to come with us. You're going to show the results, and then we can move on from there. So, again, tenacity, kind of a rebel, but he did become an ace and stayed for a pretty darn long career in the Air Force. So, the last one, Colonel Robin Olds. He's kind of my favorite out of the 3, quite frankly. He's a World War II ace. His father was Robert Olds, so like Blessy, he had a history in the Air Force. People knew who his dad was. He's a blue blood. Even though, so you got Rickenbacker, who came from the streets and poverty, and the other 2 gentlemen, they had a support structure, great family, had everything they needed to succeed, but that just catapulted them because they still were hard workers, and they had that discipline, and that stability just catapulted them up to the top at a very early age. But unlike Blessy, who was he was an athlete, but individual athlete, track, swimming, golf, Olds was a football player and a really big, strapping young man, and always on team. He's a team athlete. So, but he was also a rebel. He rebelled against his dad. He rebelled his whole childhood. But he did what he had to do. He did the work. He got through school. He, excelled in sports. He didn't want to let his team down. So he went to West Point, and he was an athlete there at West Point, and he got in a lot of trouble. They say he wasn't a stellar student, but if you're at West Point and you're in the top third, I mean, you're doing pretty well. Plus, you're playing football. And he got into the flight program there too. After West Point, he got stuck in the States, and this is World War II. It's going on. So he graduated and got winged at West Point, but then he got stuck in training squadrons back in the States. P-38 Lightnings, very complicated, dual engine aircraft, cockpits in the middle, large wings. It had some limitations on the engine and altitude restrictions, and it was a hard airplane to fly. He excelled in it. He had 650 total hours, and 250 he amassed in the P-38, because when he got to these training squadrons back in the States, he was always volunteering and wanting to fly and getting in front of the line, and that's what you have to do. You have to be hungry to get those hours. So he was extremely proficient in the P-38, but still no combat. And, oh, by the way, even though he had all these hours, 650 total and 250 in that type model series, he wasn't a flight lead yet, and he hadn't seen combat. So he was stuck, just like Blessy was stuck. There was a wall to get him into Europe to fly missions and to be in a combat squadron. So he did a lot what the other 2 did. I mean, he used his ingenuity, his people skills, and he finally got his way over to Europe because of his hours. And the first squadron he got into, he basically, it seemed like the CO was kind of weak or soft or whatnot, and he's a fire eater, So him and some others, kind of rebellious in the squadron, very aggressive. One mission in particular they talk about, they're on a mission. They didn't see anything towards the end of the mission, and then Robin Olds sees a train on train tracks, and there's a flight of 4, and the CO is leading the flight, and they're supposedly going back to base, and Robin Olds peels off and said, "Hey, I'm going after the train, cover me." and someone over one of the four said, "Roger, got it." So attacked the train, got did some damage to the enemy, came back, and then he was chewed out. He says, "I didn't give permission to do that." I said, "Yes, sir. I heard you say Roger when I said I'm going to go attack the train and to cover me, and you said Roger." He said, "I never said that." So someone else in the flight probably said it, or he maybe said it on the radio too, but in a different voice. So it was funny because I had a flight lead, really great guy. His call sign, when I was a young captain, he was a brand new major, but he had flown combat missions in the Gulf War, in Gulf War I, and he was an exchange officer with F-16s. And he said that when he learned this trick when he was in the F-16 squadron, he said, go out as a flight of two, and when they checked in to fight another opponent, you check in. When you check into the range, you check in. Let's see, torment flight check in. 1, 2. So 2. So there was only 2. If there's 4 airplanes in the flight, you go 1, torment 1, 2, 3, 4 on the radio. So they would check in with 2 airplanes, and they would go torment flight check in. 2, 3, 4. So they did the same pilot did the radio 4 different times to mimic that they had 4 airplanes that would confuse the enemy. So someone in the flight probably did it, or he did it himself. Pretty cool. Anyway, that was the reputation he had as an aggressive pilot, and he was berated also. He got a couple kills as he went off on some solo missions, got separated, and got 2 German aircraft that was only confirmed by ground troops. So he got back. He didn't think he was going to get the credit for the kills. Yeah, they saw him kill those aircraft, and that's the only reason he didn't get reprimanded. So he's aggressive. When in doubt, attack was his motto. And actually, there was another instance where he had it was a section of 2, so 2 aircraft, and they saw 50 Me-109s, which was the top fighter that the Germans had, the Messerschmitt 109. 50 of them. So the 2, he goes out and he attacks that 50. Foolhardy? No. He understood the risk. He understood that there was, target-rich environment and it would confuse him. But they went and he got some kills during that, and his wingman got some kills. So by the end of the war, this guy, Robin Olds, he's 22 years old. He's a major, and he's a squadron commander. He's got 13 kills to his credit. So looks like he's going to be fast-tracked. I mean, top of the game at 22 years old. What a great era to be a freaking fighter pilot. And he flew P-38s, which was harder, but then they transferred over to P-51s as well, and he got kills in the P-51s. He eventually did get a squadron commander who was extremely aggressive and let him basically be Robin Olds. So after the war, he went and flew jets. He was on he was on the team that did demos, but it wasn't called the Thunderbirds back then. It was just a demo team. So he did that for a while. He was assigned to the British Air Force, RAF. He went back to England and flew Meteors. And in the book, he talks about that tour as being awesome. So the Meteor was the British jet that they developed after World War II, right? And he got to fly in the Meteor. But they thought so highly of Robin Olds that they made him a squadron commander, which is a big deal in Britain. He said that meant more to me than any of my medals that I earned in the Air Force. So now he gets a command of a jet squadron at the Greater Pittsburgh Airport, but it's a reserve squadron and a reserve group, and now Korea kicks off. And, you've got one of your most aggressive officers. He obviously ruffled some feathers after the war, after being at the top of his game, getting to a peacetime Air Force or peacetime Marine Corps or peacetime Navy. It's a different zoo, right? People change, techniques, tactics, and procedures change, and the environment changes a bit as well. So that's where he was at. But now Korea's kicking off, and he's like, I'm getting to Korea. I'm going to figure out a way to get to Korea. Yeah, the words out of a CO's mouth. If I'm not going, you're not going. You're staying here. Long story short, powers that be, he tried every angle he possibly could, and also to resign his commission and leave the Air Force. He didn't go to Korea. You have one of your best, most aggressive combat pilots in World War II. 13 kills, CO, commanding officer at 22 years old. You got to be kidding me, right? So now he's stiff-armed from going to Korea. So in 1958, after missing Korea, they sent him to the last place he wanted to be, the Pentagon, and in a nuke division. So since this World War II success, he was thrown into an important but a non-war fighting job. And he'd keep getting these non-war fighting jobs almost as if he was being punished somehow. He writes paper after paper after paper, and basically gets a reputation that he's kind of a rabble rouser, and he's kind of strapping ace, walking around the Pentagon, trying to fix stuff later. So 11 years later, he gets a stint at the War College, and he's finally given command of a jet squadron in England. And he's a commander of the F-101 squadrons, and their mission was to fly missions to one nuclear bomb per aircraft and fly it into Russia at targets and basically kill during the Cold War. That was their mission. And this swashbuckling warfighter, he needed a foil, and his foil was Chappie James, first black four-star general. A lot of combat experience, and just gregarious. But what Robin Olds didn't have, he had. Robin Olds was not a politician. Robin Olds didn't build bridges. He burnt them. Chappie, he knew everybody, and everyone loved Chappie. And basically, he picked him to be his second in command, and would be his friend and fly with him in Vietnam eventually. But Vietnam didn't happen. Vietnam didn't almost happen for him. Again, trying to stiff-arm him to keep him out of Vietnam. So it's kicking off. He's at the end of his squadron commander tour, flying F-101s, and he's picked up for brigadier general. He gets selected. He's a general. There's no way he's going to be a baby general and then be able to go to Vietnam and fly combat missions as a general. So he's like, heck with it, man. I'm going to figure something out. So he decides to put on an air show without asking permission. A performance air show with F-101s. He plans the whole thing out, executes it, and that's a big no-no. I mean, they're flying this big air show, and it's like a court-martial offense. Didn't ask permission, just went out and did it, right? And he's selected for brigadier general. Long story short, he is taken off the list for brigadier general, but his feeling was like, hey, so what are they going to tell me? They're not going to court-martial me. I'm going to select for brigadier general, so I'll do something. So he gets selected because somebody in the Air Force knows of his fighting skills, and there's an Air Force wing in Vietnam who's not, again, they're not doing very well at all. And they know his leadership ability, and they know his tenaciousness. So they're like, okay, we'll give this assignment to Robin Olds, the World War II fighter. 2 decades later, he hadn't been in combat in 2 decades, but he's been training as a warrior. His mind has been warrior-like the whole time, even walking the halls of the Pentagon. So he takes Chappie with him to Udon Air Force Base in Thailand, where they conducted flight missions, right? So he went and selected as the wing commander. Actually, the wing commander, General William Spike Momier, who had 8 kills in World War II, knew they needed a warrior to lead the wing. Olds, despite his disdain for discipline, was selected. So the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing was stationed in Ubon, Thailand, and they're flying, at the time, F-4s and F-100s, the Thud. And the reason they needed a leadership change there in the first 3 months of getting into combat, and this is in 1966. Their first 3 months of combat, they lost 11 aircraft and 22 pilots to MiGs and ground fire. Everyone is exhausted, demoralized, and it was like completely not what these Americans signed up for. But again, they're warriors. They're flying these aircraft, and it seems like the war is being fought from Washington, D.C. So for 2 decades, Olds has been advocating for these 3 skills: gunnery, dogfighting, and dive bombing, and they were all lacking. So he brought that mentality to Ubon when he became the wing commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing as a colonel. He was Brigadier General Select. Now he's off the list. So, but he's the old guy now, and he remembers when he was back in World War II, when he was the young guy and the old guy came in. He had to prove himself. He felt that way too. He got in front of his men. He says, "I'm going to lead you all. I don't know this aircraft as well as you do, but I will learn it and be better at it than you will." So he took everyone under his wing and put them first. He put the maintenance department first. He went and revamped the maintenance facilities. He revamped the base, chow hall, everything. He took care of his troops. And oh, by the way, he was flying. So he's the old guy now, but he knows he has to prove his worth to his new command. One demoralizing event after another, that's what he's faced with. So he gets these 2 strapping, intelligent fire eaters. And if you've got that mindset, you can figure someone out in a minute by talking to them, seeing if they're a fire breather or what they have up their sleeve. So he comes up with this Operation Bolo, and he keeps the planning cell, and he's included in this planning cell, very, very secretive. Comes up with it. He gets permission, by the way, from his bosses all the way up to the general of the Air Force in Vietnam. But again, he's schmoozing them, and then Chappie's with him as well here. Chappie basically is his foil. He's the guy that's building the bridges after Robin Olds burns him, and making a name for himself, making a great name for himself. So he does a lot of horse trading and gets these pods on loan, puts sway braces on the F4s so they look like the Thunder Chiefs, which they call the Thuds. And they never called it the Thunder Chief, by the way. The F-105s and F4s, that's what they had in the wing. Thunder Chief, the F-105 was the Thunder Chief. They never called the F-105 the Thunder Chief. The pilots didn't. They called it the Thud because that's what it sounded like when it crashed. Just a big, bulky, nuclear age fighter bomber. But the F-4s were actually designed as a fleet defense aircraft with missiles for the Navy, and the Air Force bought them. Okay, so they don't have any guns. A lot of challenges in maintenance department to make this mission happen. And the opening statement of this was the dogfight that came out of it and kind of catapulted the momentum for the Air Force from then on. Operation Bolo was a complete success. And I'll just read the thing here. So Olds is shaping up his new unit and makes his move. MiG-21s are now hunting Americans and winning. He pitches his plan to the general and gives him the green light. Olds picks out the 2 smartest warfighters to come up with the plan. They planned in total secrecy. The plan was to make the Vietnamese and ground crews think the F-4s were F-105s. Using their electronic countermeasures packages and the way they spoke to each other on the radios, they wanted the F-4 package to look like the F-105s. They would imitate the route, the chatter of the F-105 missions to lure the MiGs up. So now, Operation Bolo is a complete success. After 2 months, he proved his worth and earned more victories in the air. Having come out of the first 3 dismal months, leadership wins the day again. He flew, and they had many victories. He reminisces about all the papers he had written about tactics before he got this assignment, and he found himself in a Navy jet carrying World War II bombs, a gun sight not nearly as good as his P-51 in 1945. They are going in to drop bombs, and there's going to be flak, SAMs, and MiGs. But don't worry, I've been assured by the generals that this would never happen again. He says that to his wingman on the radio before they go into downtown Saigon when they go downtown to do a mission down there. So after lots of flying, high-risk missions, he scored 4 kills and was the top ace in Vietnam. On June the 2nd, 1966, there were 3 victories claimed, and one of them was Olds, but none of them were confirmed. It's kind of fishy, though. So his foil, Chappie James, who knew all the scuttlebutt, found out in D.C. that, and told Olds, hey, man, when you get your 5th kill, they're going to bring you back home. So when you become the first ace in Vietnam, you're going to be packing your bags, and you won't be the commander anymore. So he never confirmed any 5th kill. The word on the street in the book was he gave the opportunities to kill MiGs to his wingmen, or didn't take credit for it at all. And there's a lot of, if you've got your Rio in the back seat, and you're not claiming a victory, I mean, he's taking the hit too. So there's a lot of back and forth on that, whether he did claim more victories or he gave them to his wingmen, but there were more victories that weren't confirmed. He wanted to stay in there and lead his men. What did he, I mean, heck, since he was 22 years old, I mean, it's kind of hard to beat that. He had 13 victories in World War II. He'd been stiff-armed because of his bad decision not to grow up. I was told that once. Grow up, be a politician. He kept that warrior spirit, and that warrior spirit was the reason he became a wing commander in Vietnam after not being promoted to brigadier general. At the gnashing of teeth of fellow officers, he was given a command, and it was the command at the Air Force Academy. He was given a star. He made 2 stars before he retired, and he was the commandant of the Air Force Academy, which is pretty cool, teaching those young Air Force cadets how to be warriors, right? That's what happened to him afterwards. Get back into Vietnam, though. So he was the ace of aces, World War II, kept out of the fight in Korea, had all these assignments and kicked ass in every single one of his assignments. His people absolutely loved him because he took care of them first. And oh, by the way, he went and flew as much as he possibly could, and turned the dismal, kill ratio from his wing in Vietnam to greatest victory, 17 kills, and he had most of them. So awesome warrior. He was first and foremost a leader, and it was inevitable he become an ace. Is there a warrior gene out of these 3 gentlemen, Rickenbacker, Blessy, and Olds? I don't think there's a warrior gene. They all had things in common. The common threads were, hard work and discipline, competitiveness. They wanted to compete all the time, and no matter what they did, they wanted to be the best. And they all had, in their youth, successes in their youth. Okay, and I think that foundation catapulted them into having the confidence to be creative, a rebel, and to bring that creativity and rebelliousness into their leadership. And that's the only way you're going to succeed in a losing organization and turn it around. Those are the ingredients to be a change agent. You can't be one of the boys or a politician to be a change agent. So that's where these guys all lived in and were comfortable in. And quite frankly, that's why I picked them. So if you want to be an ace in business, if you're an entrepreneur, you want to be an ace in your company, you're going to have some of these traits. But beware, know what the landscape is like, know the political scene. If you're going to be a rebel rouser, make sure that your bosses are good with it if you're going to be able to make change. Because quite frankly, most bosses out there want change, and change for the positive. And there's going to be some feathers ruffled. There's going to be some feelings hurt. There's going to be some people that you have to get rid of. But in the long run, you have got to understand that, people are resistant to change, and you've got to be creative in the way you do that. And you want to bring on those people that are on. You can tell the ones that are on the fence. A lot of times, they're resisting, and then finally, they come on your side, and they're on board. eventually. Some of them may have been your enemy before. So there you have it. All these guys, they wrote too. Every one of them had 4 common threads. They all wrote, and they all shared their knowledge. And you know people in business, and I know people in the military that kept their hard-earned wisdom to themselves, right? They all wanted to share all their knowledge and what they learned in the cockpit and out of the cockpit. And they wanted to lead their teams, and they took care of their people first. Bottom line, what do you need to become an ace in your life? Lead, work, build your team, write, and communicate. Walk the walk. You got to take care of your people, lead, learn, work your ass off, share all that hard-earned wisdom, put everyone else in front, and then go show them what you can do in the airplane, or go show them what you can do out in the field, whether it's logistics, or you're drilling a well, or you're selling widgets, or you're selling cars, or you're selling trains, or you're selling airport. It doesn't matter. Go show them, walk the walk. Aces in command, be the ace in your life. If you want to be an ace, you got to do this stuff. Discipline, hard work, putting other people in front of you. So, with that, appreciate you watching, and stay tuned for episode 004 coming up. Doomed to Repeat a podcast. Don't repeat the same mistakes that some of these guys made, because they probably would have been asked to come to be in the squadrons if they didn't burn so many bridges. But it's a tightrope. You got to walk that tightrope. You can be a rebel, but you got to get along. Chappie was able to do it. You know people that are able to walk that walk. Be chameleon-like, you know, because at the end of the day, it's all about the team. At the end of the day, it's all about the mission. At the end of the day, it's all about the P&L in your company. If that's improving, then you're doing your job. Let everyone else take the credit, and you can walk around quietly knowing that you had your part, you're doing your part. So for next time, from the Doomed to Repeat It podcast team, this is Chuck, over and out.